Sometimes the weight of a father's absence shapes a man's entire life. For 68-year-old Clay Morrow, that absence turned into decades of quiet mockery in a small western town that never understood him. They called him the crazy cowboy when he returned to his inherited land and spent years building something inside the hollow trunk of a giant oak tree. They laughed when he whispered about secrets hidden within. But when Clay finally unlocked the door to his secret treehouse, what he discovered would change everything. Not treasure or gold, but journals and photographs from the father who vanished when Clay was just a boy. What truths had his father left behind in that ancient tree? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town of Redemption Flats sat in a fold of high desert country, where the wind carried memories across sagebrush and stone. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your business before you did, where reputations were passed down like heirlooms, and where forgiveness came slow, if it came at all. Clay Morrow had learned that lesson young, and it had followed him through every year of his life like a shadow he couldn't shake. He stood now at the edge of his property, a weathered man with silver stubble and hands that bore the scars of hard work. The sun was beginning its descent behind the ridge, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust. Before him rose the oak tree that had defined so much of his existence, a giant that must have been standing when the first settlers came through this valley. Its trunk was wider than 3 men standing shoulder to shoulder, its branches spreading like the arms of something ancient and patient. Clay had inherited this plot of land when he was 18, right after his mother died. She'd held onto it through years of struggle, working herself to exhaustion at the diner in town, while Clay grew up wild and resentful. The land had come down through her family, though no one seemed to know much about how they'd acquired it. Just 10 acres of scrub and stone, with this magnificent oak right in the center, as if someone had planted the property line around it specifically. His truck, a battered Ford that had seen better decades, sat parked near the remnants of what had once been a small homestead. The original structure had burned down long before Clay was born, another family mystery no one seemed inclined to explain. All that remained were some foundation stones and the chimney, standing like a monument to something lost. The town had always looked at Clay with suspicion. Part of it was his father. Thomas Morrow had vanished when Clay was 9 years old, simply walked out one morning and never came back. Some said he'd run off with another woman. Others whispered darker theories involving debts and dangerous men. Clay's mother had never spoken of it, and that silence had eaten at him for years. The other part was Clay himself. He'd been a troubled kid, angry and defensive, always ready for a fight. He'd left Redemption Flats at 20, joined the Merchant Marine, and spent 30 years working on cargo ships that took him to ports he could barely pronounce. But the land had called him back. Maybe it was getting older, or maybe it was the way the ocean had started feeling less like freedom and more like running. He'd returned 5 years ago, a man in his 60s with nothing to show for his years away, except a modest pension and the same questions he'd left with. The townspeople hadn't welcomed him back. Martha Henley at the general store still treated him with cool politeness, as if he might pocket something if she looked away. Bob Sutton, who ran the hardware store, would help him but never made conversation. Even the younger generation seemed to have absorbed the old attitudes, though they'd never known Thomas Morrow or the circumstances of his leaving. Clay had started working on the oak tree about 3 years ago. The tree had always been hollow. Lightning had struck it sometime in the past century, splitting the heart out of it, but somehow leaving it alive and growing. You could step inside through a natural opening and find yourself in a chamber large enough to stand in, the walls formed by living wood that still drew water and nutrients from the earth. That's when Clay had found the first sign. He'd been clearing out decades of accumulated leaves and debris from inside the hollow when his hand had brushed against something carved into the inner wall. Using a flashlight, he'd made out letters, worn but deliberate. Team 1976, his father's initials. The year before Clay was born. It had struck him like a physical blow. His father had known this tree, had been inside it, had left his mark here. Clay had spent the next 3 months carefully excavating the hollow, working with the reverence of an archaeologist at a sacred site. He'd found more carvings. Some were just scratches and marks, but others were phrases she doesn't know yet. This is the only way. For the boy, the discoveries had consumed him. He'd started talking about them in town, trying to find anyone who might remember his father spending time out here. But the more he talked, the more people pulled away. They thought he was chasing ghosts, going senile, becoming the kind of old man who lives in the past, because the present has nothing left for him. So Clay had stopped talking. Instead, he'd started building. If his father had used this tree for something, whatever that something was, then Clay would honor it by creating something lasting. He'd designed a treehouse that would fit entirely within the hollow trunk, accessible only through a reinforced door he'd installed in the natural opening. It had taken him 3 years of weekends and long summer days, working alone, carrying lumber and supplies across his property while the town watched and whispered. They'd called him crazy. The crazy cowboy with his tree fort, as if he were a child playing make-believe, instead of a grown man following the only thread he had to understand his father's disappearance. But today, this evening, with the light going golden and soft, Clay had finished. The door was hung, equipped with a lock he'd ordered special from a catalogue. The interior was complete. He'd built it like a small cabin, with shelves and a bench, even a small window he'd cut that looked out through a knothole to the west. Tomorrow he would open it properly, but tonight he wanted to just stand here and look at what he'd accomplished. Sarah Brightwell, his nearest neighbor, came walking up the dirt road that separated their properties. She was 71, a widow who'd lived in Redemption Flats her entire life. Unlike most of the town, she'd always been kind to Clay, bringing him meals when she baked extra, never prying but always present in that quiet way some people have of offering support without making a show of it. "It's really something, Clay," she said, stopping beside him and looking up at the oak. The door he'd installed was barely visible from this angle, camouflaged by the natural bark texture. "Your father would have been proud." "You knew him?" Clay asked. It was a question he'd asked 100 times of 100 people, always hoping for a different answer. Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. "Not well. He was a quiet man, kept to himself mostly. But I remember he used to walk out here sometimes, in the evenings. I'd see him from my kitchen window, heading toward this tree." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "He had a burden, Clay. You could see it in the way he carried himself." "What kind of burden?" "The kind men don't talk about. The kind that comes from before, from other places and other choices." She reached out and touched his arm gently. "You did good work here. Whatever you find or don't find in that tree, you built something real. That matters." After she left, Clay stood in the gathering darkness, listening to the evening sounds, crickets beginning their chorus, the distant call of a hawk, the whisper of wind through the oak's vast canopy. He thought about his father walking this same ground, standing beneath these same branches. Had Thomas Morrow felt the way Clay felt now, caught between the past and the future, searching for something he couldn't name? Clay had brought a sleeping bag and provisions to the old homestead foundation. He'd camp here tonight, keep watch over his completed work. In the morning, he'd unlock that door and see what, if anything, waited inside beyond what he'd built himself. His father's carvings suggested there was something more, something hidden in the spaces within the hollow that Clay's construction might have revealed or concealed further. As he spread out his sleeping bag on the ground near the old chimney, Clay pulled out the one photograph he had of his father. It was creased and faded, kept in his wallet for decades. Thomas Morrow looked back at him, a man in his early 30s, standing beside a truck, squinting into the sun. He wasn't smiling, but there was something in his expression that wasn't quite sadness either. Determination, maybe, or resignation. "Tomorrow," Clay said softly to the photograph, to the tree, to the memory of a man he'd spent his whole life trying to understand. "Tomorrow, I'll see what you left behind. The stars emerged one by one overhead, and the oak tree stood silent and patient, holding its secrets as it had for decades, waiting for morning and for truth. Clay woke to the sound of a truck engine cutting through the dawn quiet. He sat up quickly, his back protesting the night spent on hard ground, and saw a county sheriff's vehicle pulling up to his property line. Sheriff Raymond Kowalski emerged, a man in his 50s with a barrel chest and the kind of face that had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. "Morning, Clay," Kowalski called out, approaching with his thumbs hooked in his belt. "Got a call from someone in town saying you might be in some kind of distress out here. Camping on your own land now?" Clay stood, brushing dirt from his jeans. "Just wanted to be here when the sun came up. Is that illegal, Ray? No law against a man sleeping under the stars on his own property." The sheriff's eyes moved to the oak tree, to the door that was now visible in the morning light. "Heard you finished your project. Mind if I take a look?" There was something in Kowalski's tone that wasn't quite curiosity, wasn't quite official concern. Clay studied him for a moment, then gestured toward the tree. "Haven't opened it yet myself. Was planning to do that this morning." They walked together across the scrub grass. Up close, the door looked even better than Clay had hoped. Solid oak, fitted into the natural opening with care, the hinges he'd installed barely visible. He'd carved his own initials into it, just below eye level, C, MJ 2025, right below where his father's initials had been carved on the inner wall. "Your daddy used to come out here," Kowalski said suddenly. "I was just a deputy then, young and eager to prove myself. Used to patrol out this way sometimes." He paused, seeming to debate how much to say. "The summer before he left, I saw him out here maybe a dozen times. He'd park his truck way back by the road and walk in. Thought maybe he was meeting someone, having an affair or something like that. But I never saw anyone else." Clay's heart began to beat faster. "Did you ever ask him about it?" "Once. Stopped him on his way back to his truck one evening. Asked if everything was all right, if he needed any help. You know what he said?" Kowalski's expression was distant, remembering. "He said, 'I'm trying to make things right, deputy. That's all a man can do.'" What did he mean by that? Never found out. He disappeared 2 weeks later. We investigated, of course, missing person case. Your mother filed the report. But there was no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, nothing. His truck was found at the bus station in Ridgemont, keys in the ignition. After that, the trail went cold. Kowalski looked at Clay directly. "I always wondered if whatever he was doing out here had something to do with his leaving." Clay pulled the key from his pocket, a simple brass key he'd had cut for the padlock. His hands were steady as he unlocked it, though his heart was hammering. The lock clicked open, and he removed it from the hasp, setting it carefully aside. "You want me to wait out here?" Kowalski asked. "No. If you've got time, I'd appreciate the company." Clay pulled the door open. It swung smoothly on its hinges, revealing the interior space. Morning light streamed through the doorway, illuminating what he'd built. The shelves, the bench, the careful craftsmanship. But there was something else. Something Clay hadn't installed. In the back corner, partially hidden behind where one of his shelf supports met the wall, was a metal box. It was old, the kind of fireproof document safe people used to keep important papers in. It was tucked into a natural hollow in the wood, in a space that Clay's measurements had somehow missed, or that the tree's growth had concealed over the years. Clay's breath caught. He stepped inside the hollow, Kowalski following behind him. The space was tight for 2 men, but there was just enough room. Clay knelt down and carefully worked the box free. It wasn't locked, just latched. The metal was cold and slightly damp from years inside the tree. "Easy now," Kowalski said quietly. "No telling what's in there." Clay opened the latch. Inside the box were layers of items, each wrapped in plastic to protect them from moisture. On top was a leather journal, its cover worn but intact. Clay lifted it out with trembling hands and opened to the first page. The handwriting was his father's. He recognized it from old birthday cards and the few documents his mother had kept. The first entry was dated April 15th, 1976. I have to write this down. If something happens to me, someone needs to know. I can't tell Diane, it would destroy her. But maybe someday, when Clay is older, when he can understand, this will help him see why I had to do what I'm about to do. Clay's vision blurred. He wiped at his eyes roughly and continued reading. My real name isn't Thomas Morrow. I was born Michael Chen in San Francisco, 1943. My father was Chinese. My mother was white. Irish, actually. Back then, that made things complicated. But that's not the important part. The important part is what I did in 1972. Kowalski had moved closer, reading over Clay's shoulder. Neither man spoke as Clay turned the pages, his father's confession unfolding in neat, careful handwriting. I was working for a shipping company, managing freight contracts. One of our biggest clients was a pharmaceutical company that was shipping medical supplies to hospitals. Or that's what I thought. It took me 6 months to figure out that some of those shipments weren't medicine. They were heroin being smuggled in from Southeast Asia. When I confronted my supervisor, he told me to keep my mouth shut or I'd regret it. I couldn't. I went to the police, gave them everything I had. They arrested 3 people, including my supervisor. The operation got shut down. I thought I'd done the right thing, but the people at the top, the ones really running things, they didn't get caught. And they knew it was me who talked. They sent someone to my apartment. I wasn't there, but my neighbor was, an old woman who looked after me sometimes. They killed her, left her in my apartment as a message. That's when I knew I had to disappear, had to become someone else. The FBI helped me. They gave me a new name, new papers, relocated me to a small town in Wyoming where nobody would think to look. That town was Redemption Flats. They told me to start over, keep my head down, live quietly. And I did. I met Diane at the diner. She was so kind, so genuine. I fell in love with her, and that wasn't part of the plan. When she got pregnant with Clay, I was terrified. How could I be a father when I was living a lie? But I couldn't leave her. I couldn't walk away from the only good thing in my life. So I stayed. I became Thomas Morrow. I married Diane. I held my son when he was born. And for 8 years, I thought maybe I'd gotten away with it. Maybe I really could have this life. But last month, I saw him, one of them, standing outside the hardware store, watching me. I don't know if he recognized me or if he was just passing through, but I can't take that chance. I can't risk Diane or Clay being used as leverage or being hurt because of my past. I've been coming to this oak tree because it's the only place I feel safe, the only place I can think clearly. I've been making arrangements slowly, carefully. I have some money saved, hidden where Diane won't find it. I've been leaving pieces of my real life here, in this tree, in case Clay ever needs to know the truth. I don't know if I'll use them. I don't know if I'll really leave. But I have to be ready, because if they've found me, the only way to protect my family is to disappear again. And this time, for good. The entries continued through the summer of 1976. Thomas, or Michael, described his internal struggle in painful detail. He wrote about watching Clay play in the yard, about lying next to Diane at night and feeling like a fraud, about the weight of secrets and the cost of protection. The last entry was dated September 3rd, 1976, the day before he disappeared. I saw him again today. He was at the diner, sitting at the counter, watching Diane through the window of the kitchen. He's not just passing through. He's here because of me. I can't wait anymore. Tomorrow morning I'm leaving. I've left money in the tree, in a different box, buried at the base. It should be enough to help Diane if she struggles. I've written her a letter saying I had to go, that it's not her fault, that I love her. I know it won't be enough, but it's all I can give her. For Clay, I'm leaving everything else here. My real birth certificate, photos of my parents, the police reports from the case, newspaper clippings about the arrests. If he ever finds this, if he ever comes looking, maybe he can understand. I didn't abandon him because I didn't love him. I left because I loved him too much to let my past destroy his future. A father protects his children, even if it means they grow up thinking he didn't care. That's the burden I'll carry. That's the price of the choices I made when I was younger. I hope someday he can forgive me. I hope someday he knows I thought of him every single day." Clay closed the journal, unable to read through his tears. Kowalski's hand rested on his shoulder, steady and grounding. "There's more in the box," the sheriff said quietly. Clay looked down. Beneath the journal were photograph albums wrapped in plastic, official documents, newspaper clippings yellow with age, all the evidence of Michael Chen's life before he became Thomas Morrow, and at the very bottom, a sealed envelope with "For Clayton" written on it in his father's hand. Clay picked up the envelope with shaking fingers and carefully opened it. Inside was a letter, 2 pages, written in the same neat handwriting. "Dear Clayton, if you're reading this, then you found what I left behind. I don't know how old you are now, or what kind of man you've become, but I hope you're happy. I hope you've had a better life than I could give you if I'd stayed. I need you to know that leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done. Every morning I wake up and wonder what you look like, whether you remember me, if you hate me for leaving. You have every right to. But before you decide what you feel, I need you to understand why I went. Everything you need to know is in the journal, in the documents. I was a coward in some ways. I should have gone to witness protection officially, should have taken you and your mother with me. But I was terrified they'd hurt you to get to me. I thought if I disappeared alone, cleanly, they'd follow me and leave you safe. I don't know if that was right. I've second-guessed that decision every day since. What I do know is that I loved you, son. I loved you from the moment I held you in the hospital. You were the best part of me, the part that was clean and honest and good. I saw so much potential in you, so much life. I couldn't let my past poison that, so I made a choice. I became a ghost so you could be real. Your mother was the finest woman I ever knew. Take care of her, honor her, and know that our time together, however brief, was the only time in my life I felt truly at peace. I'm sorry I couldn't stay. I'm sorry I couldn't watch you grow up. I'm sorry for every birthday, every graduation, every moment I missed. But I'm not sorry for loving you. That's the one thing I got right. Be a good man, Clayton. Be better than I was. And if you can forgive me, always, your father." Clay sat inside the hollow of the oak tree for a long time after Kowalski left. The sheriff had offered to stay, but Clay needed to be alone with this, needed space to process what his entire understanding of his childhood had just been overturned. The morning had grown warm, and slants of light came through the small window he'd installed, dust motes dancing in the beams like spirits witnessing his grief. His father hadn't abandoned him. His father had loved him. Every assumption Clay had built his life around was wrong. He spread the contents of the metal box out on the bench he'd built. There were 3 photograph albums, each one documenting a different period of Michael Chen's life. The first showed a young couple. His grandparents, he realized, seeing his father's features in the man's face. There were pictures of a small grocery store in San Francisco, images of a young Michael playing on city streets, school photos that showed a bright-eyed boy who had no idea what his future would hold. The second album covered Michael's young adult years. Military service. He'd served in Vietnam, something Thomas Morrow had never mentioned. Wedding photos of Michael and a woman who wasn't Clay's mother. So his father had been married before, another secret kept. Then newspaper clippings, carefully preserved. Major drug smuggling ring busted. Whistleblower testimony leads to arrests. And finally, witness dead in apparent retaliation killing. That last article had a photo of an elderly Asian woman, Mrs. Liu, who had lived next door to Michael Chen and had been murdered in his apartment. The article said she'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, but Michael's journal made it clear she'd been killed as a message, as punishment for his cooperation with authorities. The third album was the smallest and the most painful. It contained photos that must have been taken secretly over the years after Michael became Thomas. Pictures of Clay as a baby, as a toddler, as a young boy. They were candid shots, taken from a distance. Clay playing in the yard, walking with his mother to school, helping her carry groceries. On the back of each photo was a date and a brief note in his father's handwriting. Clayton's first day of school. He looked so brave. His birthday. Wish I could be there. He's getting so tall. He looks like Diane's father. Clay realized with a start that his father had been watching him, checking on him, even after leaving Redemption Flats. For how many years? How close had he been? Tucked in the back of this album was something that made Clay's chest tighten. A birth certificate for Michael Jonathan Chen, born 1943 in San Francisco, and next to it, a death certificate for the same person, dated 1977. His father had legally died, had erased Michael Chen from existence to protect his new identity as Thomas Morrow. But then Thomas Morrow had disappeared too, leaving behind only this cache of truth hidden in a tree. Among the documents was something else, a ledger, detailing payments made to Diane Morrow from 1977 to 1993. Small amounts, $50 or $100 at a time, sent from various cities and always anonymously. Clay remembered his mother receiving those mysterious money orders over the years. She'd always said they were from a distant relative who wanted to help, but she'd never explained further. Now he understood. His father had been sending money, trying to provide for them, even from a distance, even after supposedly vanishing forever. Clay picked up a photo of his father, Thomas, Michael, whoever he really was, standing beside the oak tree. It must have been taken with a timer, because no one else was in frame. His father looked directly at the camera, and there was such sadness in his expression, such weight. This was a man who knew what he was giving up, who understood the cost of his choices. "What happened to you?" Clay asked the photograph. "Where did you go?" The question hung in the air unanswered. According to the death certificate, Michael Chen had died in a fire in Seattle in 1977, but that was clearly fabricated. Where had Thomas Morrow gone after leaving Redemption Flats? The money orders suggested he'd moved around. Postmarks from Denver, Salt Lake City, Portland, Sacramento. He'd been running, staying ahead of whoever had been looking for him. But the money orders had stopped in 1993. Clay tried to remember what he'd been doing that year. He'd have been 17, getting ready to graduate high school. His mother had been sick by then. The cancer that would eventually take her already beginning its slow work. Had his father known? Had he stopped sending money because he'd died, or because he'd decided it was finally safe to stop running? Clay spent the next hour carefully going through every document, reading every note, studying every photograph. He was building a picture of a man he'd never really known, understanding for the first time the weight his father had carried. Michael Chen had made one moral choice, to report the drug smuggling, and it had cost him everything. His identity, his first marriage, his safety, and eventually his second family. Had it been worth it? How many lives had been saved by shutting down that drug operation? How much suffering had been prevented? His mother had never known any of this. Diane had died, believing her husband had simply left, that Thomas Morrow had gotten tired of small-town life and responsibilities and had walked away. Clay had seen how that belief had hurt her, had watched her second-guess herself for years. What would it have meant to her to know the truth? Would it have made the abandonment easier to bear, or would the deception have hurt just as much? Sarah Brightwell appeared in the doorway of the tree hollow, her silhouette backlit by noon sun. "Clay, Sheriff Kowalski called me. He said you might need some company." Clay looked up, his face still wet with tears he hadn't bothered to wipe away. "He wasn't a bad man, Sarah. All these years, I thought he just left us, but he was trying to protect us." She stepped inside carefully, her eyes adjusting to the dimmer light. When she saw the spread of documents and photographs, her expression grew soft with understanding. "Tell me," she said simply. So Clay did. He told her everything. About Michael Chen and the drug smuggling ring. About the witness protection that wasn't quite official enough. About his father's fear that his past would catch up with him and hurt his family. He showed her the photographs, the journal entries, the letter that explained everything. Sarah listened quietly, occasionally picking up a photo to look at it more closely. When Clay finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Your father loved you very much. That's clear in every word he wrote. But why didn't he tell my mother? Why didn't he trust her enough to explain? Because he was protecting her too. If she didn't know, she couldn't be accused of hiding a fugitive or aiding him. She could honestly say he'd just left." Sarah's voice was gentle. "It wasn't a matter of trust, Clay. It was a matter of love. He gave up his own integrity in her eyes to keep her safe." Clay picked up another document, a newspaper clipping from 1993, 4 bodies found in Oregon. Compound drug trafficking ring. Uncovered. The article described a law enforcement raid on a remote property where a drug operation had been running for years. Several suspects were killed in a shootout, others arrested. Clay scanned the list of names, and one jumped out at him. Victor Reyes, deceased. He pulled out his father's journal and flipped back through it, looking for that name. There, in the summer of 1976, his father had written about seeing a man watching the diner. "I know it's him. Victor Reyes. He was the one who recruited me to the shipping company in the first place. He knows my face, knows everything about me. If he's here, the others can't be far behind." "Sarah, look at this." Clay showed her the clipping and the journal entry. Victor Reyes died in 1993, the same year the money orders stopped. What if my father was tracking them? What if he spent all those years moving around, staying ahead of them, until they finally got caught or killed? "Then maybe he stopped running after that," Sarah said slowly. "Maybe he felt safe enough to settle down somewhere, or maybe he died. If he was alive, why wouldn't he have come back? Why wouldn't he have at least contacted me once I was grown?" Sarah didn't have an answer to that. They sat together in the hollow of the tree, surrounded by the remnants of Michael Chen's carefully hidden life, and contemplated the mysteries that remained unsolved. After Sarah left, Clay remained in the tree. He'd brought a battery-powered lantern earlier, and he lit it now as afternoon began its slide toward evening. He reread his father's letter twice more, memorizing certain phrases. "I became a ghost so you could be real." That line struck him as particularly profound. His father had willingly become nothing so that Clay could be someone. Clay thought about his own life, the angry childhood, the years at sea, the rootlessness that had defined him. He'd been running too, in his own way, though he hadn't understood it until now. He'd been running from redemption flats, from the shame of being the abandoned boy, from the judgment of people who thought they knew his story. But they didn't know. None of them knew. As darkness fell, Clay gathered the documents carefully and packed them back into the metal box. He'd take them home, study them more carefully, see if he could trace what had happened to his father after 1993. Maybe there were records somewhere. Maybe Michael Chen was still alive, an old man living under yet another name in some quiet corner of the country. Or maybe he was dead, and this cachet in the tree was all that remained of him. Either way, Clay had something now he'd never had before, understanding. He knew why his father had left. He knew it hadn't been about not loving them. That knowledge didn't erase the years of pain, didn't magically heal the wounds of abandonment. But it recontextualized them, gave them a different meaning. His father had been a good man caught in an impossible situation. He'd tried to do the right thing, reporting criminals, protecting his family, and the world had punished him for it. That wasn't fair, but Clay had lived long enough to know that fairness wasn't a guarantee in this life. Sometimes good people got hurt. Sometimes love meant sacrifice. Sometimes the only gift a father could give his son was absence instead of danger. Clay locked the door to the treehouse and walked back toward his truck in the moonlight. Tomorrow, he'd start trying to find out what happened to Michael Chen after 1993. Tomorrow, he'd decide whether to share this discovery with anyone in town or keep it private. Tomorrow, he'd figure out what came next. But tonight, he simply drove home, carrying his father's secrets, feeling closer to the man than he ever had when Thomas Morrow had been alive. The next week passed in a blur of research and discovery. Clay set up his father's documents on the dining table of his small house and spent hours each day poring over them, making notes. trying to piece together the years between 1976 and 1993. He created a timeline on the wall, using string and pushpins, connecting cities with dates, tracking the path his father had taken. The pattern became clearer the more he looked. Michael Chen, or whatever name he'd been using, had moved every few months for the first several years, staying in cheap motels and rented rooms, working cash jobs that didn't require identification. The postmarks on the money orders created a map: Cheyenne, Boise, Missoula, Spokane, Seattle, Portland, Eugene. He'd stayed mostly in the Pacific Northwest, circling but never settling. Then in 1985, the pattern changed. The money orders started coming from the same general area, Northern California, small towns in timber country. They came more regularly, suggesting his father had found stable work and felt secure enough to stay in one place. That lasted until 1993, when they stopped completely. Clay called the public library in each town that appeared on his timeline, asking if they had newspaper archives from those years. Most did, digitized now and accessible online. He spent 2 solid days scrolling through articles, looking for anything that might mention his father, might give a clue to what had happened. He found something in the Eureka, California newspaper from November 1993, a small article, barely 3 paragraphs, about a mill accident. Local man killed in workplace incident. The article named the victim as Thomas Morrison, age 47, employed at Redwood Timber Mill. He'd been crushed by falling logs when a loading mechanism failed. The article mentioned that Morrison had no known family and had been living alone in a trailer on the outskirts of town. Clay read the article 3 times, his mind racing. Thomas Morrison, TM, the same initials. Age 47 would have been right for his father. Working in a timber mill under an assumed name, keeping to himself, no family. It fit. It all fit except for one crucial detail. There was no photograph. No way to confirm it was actually Michael Chen. He called the Humboldt County Coroner's office and explained that he was trying to locate information about a possible relative who might have died in 1993. The clerk was sympathetic, but explained that records that old were archived and would take time to retrieve. Clay paid the fee for a rush request and provided his contact information. While waiting for that response, Clay continued his research. He found the address of Redwood Timber Mill and discovered it had closed in 2001, the property now converted to a storage facility. But the owner of the storage facility, a man named Dale Pritchard, had worked at the mill back in the 90s. Clay got his phone number from the storage facility's website and called. "Yeah, I remember Tom Morrison," Pritchard said when Clay explained why he was calling. "Quiet guy, kept to himself. Good worker though, always on time, never complained. I was actually there when the accident happened. It was bad, real bad. We tried to get him out, but there was nothing we could do." Did he ever talk about his past? About family? Not really. He showed up in town one day looking for work, said he'd been moving around for a while. We hired him because we needed people, and he knew his way around lumber. He lived in that trailer for about 8 years, didn't socialize much, just worked and went home. Pritchard paused. "Why are you looking for information about him?" Clay made a decision. "I think he might have been my father." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Jesus, Tom never mentioned having a kid. It's complicated. He left when I was young. I'm just trying to figure out what happened to him. Well, I can tell you he was a decent man, never caused trouble, always willing to help if someone needed it. After he died, we cleaned out his trailer. There wasn't much. Some clothes, a few books. The landlord might have kept any personal items in storage. You could try calling around." Clay thanked him and hung up. He was getting closer. He could feel it. If Thomas Morrison was his father, then Michael Chen had died in 1993, far from home, living under yet another assumed name. The thought was unbearably sad. To have survived everything, to have protected his family by staying away, only to die alone in an accident. The following day, Sarah came by with lunch. She'd been checking on him regularly since the discovery in the tree, worried about how he was handling the revelations. She found him surrounded by papers and printouts, his eyes red from staring at the computer screen. "You're going to make yourself sick," she said, setting down a container of homemade soup. "When's the last time you ate?" "Yesterday, I think." Clay rubbed his face. "Sarah, I found him. I think I found where my father died." He showed her the newspaper article, explained about Thomas Morrison and the timber mill. Sarah read it carefully, then looked at him with concern. "Are you sure it's him?" "I won't know for certain until I get the coroner's records, but everything fits. The timing, the location, the initials, the fact that he had no family. It's him. I can feel it. What will you do if it is?" Clay hadn't thought that far ahead. "I don't know. See if he was buried somewhere, I guess. Maybe put up a proper headstone with his real name. And then? Clay stopped, realizing he hadn't considered what came after solving the mystery. "I don't know. Try to move forward, I suppose." Sarah sat down across from him. "Clay, finding out the truth about your father is important. But it's not the end of your story. It's just another chapter. You're 68 years old. You've got years ahead of you still. What are you going to do with them?" It was a good question, and Clay didn't have a good answer. He'd spent so much of his life defined by his father's absence, and then the last 3 years consumed by building the treehouse and discovering what lay hidden there. Who was Clayton Morrow when he wasn't chasing his father's ghost? "I've been thinking," Sarah continued, "about that treehouse you built. It's beautiful work, Clay, real craftsmanship. And it's sitting empty right now, just holding memories. What if you used it for something?" "Used it how?" "I don't know exactly. But you created something special out there, something that came from love and determination. Maybe there's a way to share that with others." Clay considered this. The treehouse, his father's hiding place, transformed into something new. Sitting empty did seem like a waste. But what could he do with a small room inside a tree? Before he could answer, his phone rang. It was the Humboldt County Coroner's Office, calling back sooner than expected. Clay answered with his heart pounding. "Mr. Morrow? This is Linda Chan from the Coroner's Office. We located the file you requested for Thomas Morrison. I have the death certificate and the coroner's report. Are you ready for the information?" "Yes." Clay's voice was barely a whisper. "The deceased, Thomas Morrison, died on November 12, 1993, from traumatic injuries sustained in a workplace accident. He was 47 years old. The body was identified through personal effects and confirmation from his employer. He was cremated, as per standard procedure when no family could be located, and the ashes were interred in the Humboldt County Cemetery in an unmarked plot." "Was there?" Clay had to clear his throat. "Was there any other information? Any personal effects that were saved?" Papers rustled. "According to the notes, the deceased's trailer was cleared by the property owner. The coroner's office retained one item, a wallet containing identification in the name Thomas Morrison, some cash, and 2 photographs. Those items would still be in our evidence storage if they weren't claimed." 2 photographs. Clay's pulse quickened. "That's what the report says. If you can provide proof of relationship, we can release those items to you." Clay looked at Sarah, then back at his wall of documentation. "I can provide that. How do I proceed?" After getting instructions and agreeing to send the necessary documentation, Clay hung up and sat in stunned silence. His father had been carrying photographs. Of what? Of whom? Clay had a feeling he knew, and the thought made his chest ache. "He had pictures," Clay said to Sarah. "Even at the end, even after all those years, he was carrying pictures." "Of you," Sarah said softly. "And probably your mother." Clay nodded, unable to speak. His father had died alone, working in a lumber mill under a false name, but he'd kept photographs of the family he'd left behind. That single detail said more than all the journal entries combined. Michael Chen had never stopped being Thomas Morrow in his heart. He'd never stopped being Clay's father. "I need to go to California," Clay said suddenly. "I need to see where he died, where he's buried. I need to bring him home." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. "Then that's what you'll do, and I'll help you however I can." That evening, Clay returned to the treehouse. He brought the lantern again and sat inside, surrounded by the walls his father had carved and the space he himself had built. 2 generations of work, 2 men trying to make meaning out of loss and love. He pulled out the letter his father had written and read it again by lantern light. The words that struck him this time were different than before. "Be a good man, Clayton. Be better than I was." His father had thought he'd failed somehow, had believed that running away made him less than he should have been. But Clay saw it differently now. Michael Chen had made an impossible choice and had lived with the consequences. He'd sacrificed his own happiness, his own identity, his own family to protect them from danger. That wasn't failure. That was love in its most painful form. "I forgive you," Clay said aloud to the empty space, to the ghost of his father that seemed to linger in the carved wood. "I understand now." "I forgive you." The words seemed to echo slightly in the hollow, and Clay felt something release inside him, a tension he'd carried for so long that he'd stopped noticing its weight. Forgiveness didn't erase the pain of those years, didn't magically make up for all the moments his father had missed. But it freed Clay from the prison of resentment he'd been living in. It allowed him to see his father as a whole person, flawed, frightened, but ultimately loving. Clay sat in the treehouse until late into the night, making plans. He'd go to California and retrieve his father's ashes. He'd bring them back to Redemption Flats and bury them properly, on this land, near this tree. He'd put up a headstone with both names, Michael Jonathan Chen and Thomas Morrow, acknowledging both the man his father had been and the man he'd become. And then Clay would figure out how to honor his father's memory, not by dwelling in the past, but by building something meaningful with the time he had left. Sarah was right. The treehouse couldn't just sit empty. It needed a purpose, needed to become something more than a memorial. But what that something was, Clay couldn't yet see. That answer would come in time, the way his father's secrets had finally emerged after decades of hiding. Some things couldn't be rushed. Some truths needed time to ripen like fruit on a branch, waiting for the right moment to fall. Clay drove to California the following week. It was a 2-day journey through desert and mountain, giving him time to think about what he'd discovered and what it meant. He'd packed carefully, the documentation proving his relationship to Michael Chen, the journal entries that explained his father's assumed identities, and the original metal box to bring back whatever remained. The Humboldt County Coroner's Office was housed in a modern building that looked nothing like Clay had imagined. Linda Chan met him in person, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and efficient movements. She reviewed his documentation carefully, comparing the handwriting in the journal to the signature on old police reports, checking dates and facts with professional thoroughness. "I believe you," she finally said. "The evidence is compelling. I'll retrieve the personal effects." She returned 15 minutes later with a small plastic bag marked with a case number and date. Inside was a worn leather wallet, a few dollars in old bills, and 2 photographs protected by plastic sleeves. Clay's hands shook as he opened the bag. The photographs were exactly what he'd expected, and somehow more painful for their ordinariness. One showed Clay at about 7 years old, standing in front of a school building on what must have been the first day of class. He was grinning at the camera, missing a front tooth. Clay didn't remember the photo being taken, but he recognized the shirt he was wearing, his favorite at that age, with a cowboy on horseback printed on the front. The second photograph showed his mother, Diane, younger than Clay remembered her, maybe in her early 30s. She was standing in the doorway of their old house, sunlight illuminating her face. She looked happy, caught in a moment of genuine joy. On the back, in his father's handwriting, "My beautiful Diane, summer 1980. Clay stared at these images for a long time. His father had carried them for 13 years, had looked at them countless times, had held on to this connection to the family he'd left behind. These photographs had been with Michael Chen when he died, were possibly the last thing he'd seen or thought about in his final moments. "Was there anything else?" Clay asked, his voice rough with emotion. Linda checked her file. The trailer where he lived was cleared by the property owner. "Most items were disposed of, but I called them yesterday when I knew you were coming. They did save a box of books and papers, not sure why, maybe they just forgot about it. It's still in their storage unit if you want to try to recover it." Clay got the address and drove to the trailer park. It had seen better days. The lots were mostly occupied by old mobile homes in various states of repair, surrounded by pickup trucks and children's toys. The office was a small building near the entrance, run by a woman who introduced herself as Betty. "You're Tom Morrison's son?" she asked, looking Clay up and down with frank curiosity. "Never knew he had family. He was a good tenant, quiet, always paid on time. I was sorry when he died." "Did you know him well?" "Well as anyone, I suppose. He'd stop by the office sometimes to pay rent. We'd chat about the weather or whatnot. He mentioned once he'd made some mistakes in his life, said he was trying to make up for them. I figured he meant something like divorce or drinking, the usual regrets folks carry around." Betty pulled out a key ring. "His trailer's long since rented out, but I kept a box of his things in storage. Didn't feel right throwing away a person's whole life, even if no one claimed it." She led Clay to a storage shed behind the office and unlocked it. Inside, among lawn equipment and old furniture, was a cardboard box labeled Morrison T. November 1993. Clay lifted it carefully, it wasn't heavy, and carried it to his truck. "Did he ever seem unhappy?" Clay asked before leaving. "Like he was hiding from something?" Betty considered this. "He seemed," she searched for the word, "settled. Like whatever he'd been running from or running toward, he'd finally made peace with it. The last year or so I noticed he smiled more. Even started keeping a little garden behind his trailer. Nothing fancy, just tomatoes and beans, but he tended it real careful-like. This image of his father, older, alone, but growing tomatoes in the California sun, struck Clay as deeply sad and somehow beautiful at the same time. Michael Chen had found a kind of peace in exile, had created a small life for himself away from the people he loved. Clay thanked Betty and drove to the Humboldt County Cemetery. It took him an hour to locate the section where unclaimed cremated remains were interred. There was a wall with small brass plaques, some marked with names and dates, others blank. According to the cemetery records, Thomas Morrison's ashes were in space C-47. Clay found it, just a number on a plaque, no name, no dates, no indication that a human life had ended there. He stood before it for a long time, trying to find the right words. "Dad," he finally said, the word feeling foreign on his tongue after so many years. "I came to bring you home. I know why you left now. I know what you were trying to do. And I want you to know," his voice broke, "I want you to know it worked. Mom and I were safe. We had hard times, but we survived. And I grew up okay. Not perfect, but okay." The cemetery was quiet, except for wind in the pine trees. Clay continued, "I'm going to take you back to Redemption Flats, back to the oak tree. You'll be with Mom again. She's buried in the town cemetery, but I think she'd understand if you're nearby, watching over the land. And maybe," he had to stop and wipe his eyes, "maybe now you can finally rest." He made arrangements with the cemetery office to have the remains disinterred and released to him. It would take a few days for the paperwork to process. While he waited, Clay found a motel room and began going through the box Betty had given him. The contents were modest, exactly what you'd expect from a man living simply. There were a dozen books, mostly worn paperbacks, westerns, mysteries, a few classics. Inside one, Clay found pressed flowers, wildflowers from California, carefully preserved between pages. In another, there were margin notes in his father's handwriting, reactions to the story, questions raised by the text. There were a few items of clothing, work shirts, a jacket with the timber mill logo, a coffee mug with a faded picture of the Golden Gate Bridge, a small radio. These ordinary objects felt weighted with significance, each one a piece of the life his father had built in exile. At the bottom of the box was a folder containing more papers. Pay stubs from the timber mill, showing Thomas Morrison had worked there from 1985 to 1993. A rental agreement for the trailer. A library card from the Eureka Public Library. And underneath all of that, more photographs. These were different from the ones in the wallet. These showed Redemption Flats, the main street, the diner where Clay's mother had worked, the school Clay had attended. They'd been taken from a distance, as if his father had returned at some point, carefully, secretly, just to see the place where his family lived. There were no people in these photos, just buildings and landscapes, memories captured on film. The last item in the folder was an envelope, unsealed, containing a letter his father had apparently written but never sent. It was addressed to Diane Morrow, dated March 1993, 8 months before he died. Clay hesitated, feeling like he was intruding on something private. But his mother was gone, and his father was gone, and if there were words that needed to be known, he was the only one left to know them. He unfolded the letter carefully. "Dear Diane, I know I have no right to write to you after all these years. I know my leaving hurt you in ways that can't be undone, and I know no explanation will ever be enough. But I'm getting older now, and the thought that I might die without you knowing the truth has become unbearable. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because loving you meant keeping you safe, and I couldn't do that if I stayed. I was in trouble, Diane. Bad trouble from before we met, and it caught up with me. The people involved. They would have used you and Clay to get to me. I couldn't let that happen, so I left, and I made sure they followed me instead of staying near you. For years I moved around, always checking to make sure you were okay, sending what money I could. I know it wasn't enough. Nothing could have been enough. But it's what I had to give. I want you to know that every day I've been gone, I've thought about you. About the way you smiled when you saw me at the end of a work day. About how you hummed while you cooked dinner. About the sound of your laugh, which was the best sound in the world. I've missed you every single moment of every single day. I remarried the woman I loved before you, back when I was someone else. But that marriage fell apart because I couldn't love her the way she deserved. My heart stayed in Redemption Flats with you. I don't know if you ever remarried, if you found happiness with someone who could be there for you properly. I hope you did. I hope you had a good life. I hope Clay grew up strong and kind. I hope when you think of me now, if you think of me at all, you can remember the good times before I ruined everything. I'm sorry, Diane. I'm so deeply sorry for the pain I caused. If there's any justice in the universe, maybe someday I'll see you again, and I can explain properly. Until then, know that you were loved. You were so very loved. Always, Thomas. Clay folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. His father had written this but hadn't sent it, probably because he knew it would only cause more pain, would reopen wounds that had maybe started to heal. It was an act of love to write it, and an act of love not to send it. His mother had died in 1999, 6 years after his father. She'd never known the truth, had gone to her grave believing her husband had simply abandoned her. Clay felt a wave of sadness for both of them. Two people who had loved each other, torn apart by circumstances neither could control, dying separately and alone. But they'd had those years together, 1968 to 1976, 8 years of marriage and family. Maybe that had to be enough. Maybe that was all anyone could ask for. Moments of happiness in between the struggles, islands of light in the darkness. Clay spent the rest of his time in California, visiting the places his father had lived and worked. He drove past the trailer park, past the lumber mill that was now a storage facility, through the streets of Eureka, where Thomas Morrison had walked and worked and tried to build a life out of the wreckage of his past. On his last day, before picking up the ashes, Clay walked along the beach. The Pacific Ocean stretched out grey and vast, waves rolling in with patient rhythm. His father would have seen this same ocean, would have stood perhaps on this same beach, thinking about the family he'd left behind on the other side of the mountains. "I'm taking you home now," Clay said to the wind and water. "You don't have to be alone anymore." The drive back to Redemption Flats took 3 days because Clay stopped frequently, needing breaks from the weight of what he was carrying. His father's ashes were in a simple urn in a protective box on the passenger seat. The photographs and personal effects were in the cardboard box in the truck bed, carefully secured. Clay had a lot of time to think during those long hours on the highway. He thought about his father's choices and his own. He thought about the nature of sacrifice and the price of keeping people safe. He thought about forgiveness and understanding, about how the stories we tell ourselves shape the lives we live. He'd spent 42 years believing his father hadn't loved him enough to stay. That belief had colored everything: his relationships, his decisions, his sense of self-worth. It had driven him to the ocean, to ships and foreign ports, to anywhere that wasn't redemption flats. It had made him distrustful of attachment, wary of putting down roots, convinced that everyone eventually left. But it had been a false story, built on incomplete information. His father had loved him desperately, had sacrificed everything to keep him safe. That didn't erase the pain of those years, but it reframed them, gave them a different meaning. Clay hadn't been abandoned because he was unlovable. He'd been protected because he was precious. How many other stories in his life were equally false? How many assumptions had he made about himself and others that were based on misunderstandings? The thought was both liberating and terrifying. If he'd been wrong about this central fact of his existence, what else might he be wrong about? By the time Clay pulled into Redemption Flats, the sun was setting behind the western ridge, painting the sky in shades of coral and gold. He drove straight to his property, to the oak tree that had been the keeper of secrets for so many years. He sat in his truck for a while, looking at the treehouse door that was barely visible in the fading light, thinking about what came next. Tomorrow, he'd make arrangements for a proper burial. He'd commission a headstone that honored both of his father's identities. He'd create a place where people could come to remember Michael Chen and Thomas Morrow, the man who had tried to do the right thing even when it cost him everything. But tonight, Clay wanted to spend time in the treehouse one more time, wanted to sit in that space between past and present and feel his father's presence. He gathered the urn and the box of personal effects and walked across the darkening land to the oak. Inside the hollow, he lit the lantern and arranged his father's belongings with care. The photographs he placed on the shelf he'd built, the books he stacked neatly in the corner, the letter to his mother he left in its envelope, a private conversation that had never been finished but didn't need to be, and the urn with his father's ashes he set in the center of the small space, surrounded by the carved walls where Michael Chen had left his mark so many years ago. "Welcome home, Dad," Clay said quietly. "You've been gone a long time." He sat on the bench and pulled out his father's journal, intending to read through it one more time. But as he opened it, something fell out from between the pages, a small piece of paper he hadn't noticed before, tucked near the back of the journal. He unfolded it carefully. It was a list, written in his father's handwriting, dated just a few weeks before he'd left Redemption Flats in 1976. The heading read, "Things I Want Clay to Know Someday." Clay's vision blurred as he read, "Your mother loved you more than anything in this world. Be good to her. The oak tree has been here longer than any of us. Respect old things. They have wisdom. Making a mistake doesn't define you. How you try to make it right does. Love is worth the risk even when it hurts. Sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing. You're stronger than you know. Don't be afraid of hard work or hard choices. Family isn't just blood. It's the people who show up when you need them. This land is yours. Take care of it. Maybe build something here that lasts. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to teach you these things myself. I loved you from the moment I held you, and I'll love you until my last breath and beyond. Never doubt that." Clay read the list 3 times, each item landing like a gift he'd waited his whole life to receive. His father had been thinking about him, trying to leave guidance, even knowing he wouldn't be there to provide it in person. These weren't random thoughts. They were carefully chosen principles, a father's last teachings to a son who would have to grow up without him. Several items struck Clay with particular force. The oak tree has been here longer than any of us. His father had known this tree was special, had been coming here long before the carvings, long before the hiding place, and maybe build something here that lasts. Clay had done exactly that, without knowing it was fulfilling his father's wish. The treehouse was his answer to that challenge, his way of creating something permanent on this inherited land. But it was the last item that broke Clay open completely. "I loved you from the moment I held you, and I'll love you until my last breath and beyond." Those were the words Clay had needed to hear for 42 years. His father had loved him, had always loved him. Nothing else mattered as much as that simple, powerful truth. Clay sat in the treehouse long into the night, crying in a way he hadn't cried since he was a child. These weren't tears of sadness exactly, though sadness was part of it. They were tears of release, of grief acknowledged and processed, of wounds beginning finally to heal. He grieved for his father's lost life, for his mother's confusion and pain, for the family they could have been if circumstances had been different. But he also felt something else emerging through the grief: gratitude. He was grateful to have found the truth, grateful to understand his father's sacrifice, grateful to have these remnants of love that had survived death and time. The treehouse, the journals, the photographs, the list, they were proof that love didn't end just because someone left. It persisted, patient and enduring, waiting to be recognized. As midnight approached, Clay heard footsteps outside. He looked through the small window and saw Sarah approaching with a flashlight, concern evident in her posture. "Clay, I saw your truck. I wanted to make sure you were all right." He opened the door and gestured her inside. The space was tight for two people, but Sarah managed to perch on the edge of the bench. She looked around at the arranged items, at the urn in the center of the small room, and her expression softened with understanding. "You brought him home." "I did. Found more stuff too. Letters, photographs, a list he wrote for me." Clay handed her the piece of paper with the 10 items. "He was thinking about me, Sarah. Right up until he left, he was thinking about what I'd need to know." Sarah read the list slowly, her eyes welling up. When she finished, she looked at Clay with such tenderness that he had to look away. "Your father was a remarkable man, and he raised, even from a distance, a remarkable son. I didn't feel remarkable for most of my life. I felt broken, abandoned, but you weren't. You were protected. And look what you did with that protection. You lived. You built something that lasts, just like he asked. You honored him without even knowing it." Clay hadn't thought of it that way. He'd believed he was chasing ghosts, trying to understand the past. But maybe he'd actually been building the future, creating something his father would have been proud of. "What do I do now?" Clay asked. "I have the truth. I brought him home, but I don't know what comes next." "Now you live," Sarah said simply. "You take what you learned from all this and you use it. Your father's list, those aren't just things he wanted you to know. They're things he wanted you to do. So do them. I'm 68 years old. How much time do I have left to do anything meaningful?" "My husband died when he was 52, Sarah said. "I thought my life was over then. But I've had nearly 20 years since, and some of my best moments happened in those years." "Time isn't about quantity, Clay. It's about what you do with however much you have." After Sarah left, Clay read through his father's list one more time. This time, thinking about each item as an instruction rather than just information. Be good to people who loved him. He could do that. Respect things that had endured. This oak, this land, the memories of good people. Try to make things right when he made mistakes. He'd been doing that by searching for the truth. Love was worth the risk. Maybe it wasn't too late to learn that lesson. The hardest thing and the right thing being the same. Clay understood that now in a way he hadn't before. His father had done the hardest thing possible, and it had been right, even though it caused so much pain. And family being the people who showed up, Sarah had been more family to Clay in the past few weeks than many blood relatives were in a lifetime. Take care of the land. Build something that lasts. Clay looked around the treehouse, at the craftsmanship he'd put into every joint and surface. He'd done that. But maybe there was more to do. Maybe this was just the beginning of what could be built here. As dawn approached, Clay made a decision. He'd bury his father's ashes here at the base of the oak tree, and he'd create something more than just a memorial. He'd make this place a sanctuary, a space where people could come to remember, to reflect, to find the kind of peace his father had been seeking when he carved his initials into the tree all those years ago. He didn't know exactly what form that would take yet, but he had time to figure it out. He had the rest of his life, however long that might be, to honor his father's memory, not through grief, but through creation. through building something that would last beyond both of them. The sun rose over the eastern ridge, sending golden light through the treehouse window. Clay sat in that light, surrounded by his father's belongings, and felt for the first time in his life that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Clay spent the next morning at the town cemetery, making arrangements for a burial plot near his mother's grave. The cemetery director, an efficient woman named Margaret Foster, listened to his unusual request with professional calm. "You want to bury cremated remains on private property?" she asked, making notes on her clipboard. "Just outside the cemetery boundary, on my land that borders it. My mother's buried here, and I want my father nearby, but on the family property." Clay had worked out the logistics carefully. His land ran right up against the cemetery's eastern edge. If he chose the right spot, his father would be close to his mother, but still on Morrow land, at the foot of the oak tree. That's legal, as long as you follow regulations, proper depth, notify the county, maintain the site properly. Margaret consulted her records. "Your mother is Diane Morrow, correct? Plot 43, Section B?" "That's right. I remember when she passed." "Nice lady. Always had a kind word." Margaret looked up from her clipboard. "I heard you found something in that oak tree of yours. People are talking." Of course they were. This was Redemption Flats, where privacy was a luxury and everyone's business was community property. Clay had expected this. "I found some things my father left behind. Personal items, journals. Turns out he had reasons for leaving that I didn't understand before." Margaret's expression shifted from professional courtesy to genuine interest. "Oh? The story always was that Thomas just took off one day, left you and your mother high and dry." Clay made a decision in that moment. He could keep his father's secret, could protect Michael Chen's hidden identity even now. Or he could trust that enough time had passed, that the people who'd been hunting his father were long dead or imprisoned, and that the truth might actually heal something in this town that had judged the Morrow family for decades. "That's not what happened," Clay said. "My father was in witness protection or something like it. He testified against criminals, and they came after him. He left to keep my mother and me safe. He sent us money over the years, anonymously, and he died in 1993 in California, living under another name, still protecting us." Margaret stared at him, her pen motionless above her clipboard. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious. I have documentation, police reports, newspaper articles. My father wasn't a man who abandoned his family. He was a man who loved them enough to become a ghost." The story spread through Redemption Flats like wildfire over the next few days. Clay had known it would, had counted on it, actually. He visited the diner where his mother had worked and told the story again to Martha Henley, who'd treated him with suspicion for years. He went to the hardware store and told Bob Sutton, who'd always been cool but never hostile. He even went to the newspaper office, such as it was, now mostly an online operation run by a young woman named Jessica Chen, which made Clay smile at the coincidence of the name. Jessica wanted to write an article about the discovery. Clay agreed, on the condition that she get the facts right and understand the larger story. He spent 3 hours with her, showing her the journal entries, the photographs, explaining about drug smuggling and witness protection, and the impossible choices his father had faced. "This is incredible," Jessica said, taking notes rapidly. "It's like something out of a movie. The mysterious cowboy who turns out to have a tragic past, the hidden treehouse, the lifetime of secrets. And you built this whole structure without knowing what you'd find?" "I knew there was something. I'd found my father's carvings inside the hollow, but I didn't know about the metal box or any of the rest until I finished the treehouse and looked more carefully." "Can I see it?" "The treehouse." Clay thought about this. The treehouse was private, was sacred in a way, but Jessica's enthusiasm was genuine, and maybe showing it would help people understand what he'd created. "All right. Come out tomorrow morning." When Jessica arrived the next day with a camera, Clay led her to the oak tree. The morning light filtered through the branches, creating patterns of shadow and gold on the ground. He unlocked the door and let her step inside, watching her face as she took in the craftsmanship, the carved walls, the carefully arranged space. "This is beautiful work, Mr. Morrow. You really built this yourself. Every board, every joint. Took me 3 years." Jessica photographed the interior respectfully, not touching anything. She paused at the shelf where Clay had arranged his father's photographs. "May I include one of these in the article?" Clay handed her the photograph of his mother, Diane, standing in the doorway. "This one. My father carried it with him for 17 years. He loved her until the day he died." The article came out 2 days later in the online edition of the Redemption Flats Chronicle. Jessica had written it beautifully, balancing the factual details with the emotional weight of the story. The headline read, "Local Cowboy Discovers Father's Hidden Life, a Story of Sacrifice and Love." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Clay's phone started ringing before noon. Sarah called to tell him the article had already been shared hundreds of times on social media. Martha Henley, from the general store, called to apologize for how she'd treated him over the years. Bob Sutton stopped by the property in person, shook Clay's hand and said, "Your father was a good man. I wish I'd known." But the most unexpected response came from Victor Chen, who called Clay's number that evening. "Mr. Morrow? My name is Victor Chen. I'm a nephew of Michael Chen, your father. I've been searching for information about him for the last 10 years. I saw the article online and I had to reach out." Clay's heart began to pound. "Your family?" "I am. My father was Michael's younger brother. Uncle Michael disappeared from our lives in the 70s, and we never knew why. My father died thinking his brother had just abandoned the family, and it haunted him." Victor's voice was thick with emotion. "Reading about what really happened, it explains everything. And knowing he had a son, knowing you exist, that means the world to me." They talked for 2 hours. Victor told Clay about the Chen family in San Francisco, his grandparents who'd run the grocery store, Michael's siblings, the cousins Clay had never known existed. He learned that his father had been the eldest of 4 children, that he'd been protective of his younger brothers and sister, that he'd been known for his strong sense of right and wrong, even as a young man. "That's what got him into trouble," Victor said. "He couldn't look away from wrong being done. He had to act. That was just who he was. He wrote in his journal that testifying was the right thing to do, even though he knew it would cost him everything. That sounds like Uncle Michael. My father used to say Michael had the strongest moral compass of anyone he'd ever known. I wish they could have reconciled before Dad died." Clay invited Victor to come to Redemption Flats for the burial ceremony he was planning. Victor agreed immediately and said he'd bring other family members who'd want to meet Clay and pay their respects to Michael. Clay hung up feeling both excited and overwhelmed. He had family. His father had brothers and sisters, cousins he'd never met. The Chen family tree had branches Clay had never known existed, and they were reaching out to him now, across the years of separation. Over the next week, Clay prepared for the burial. He chose a spot at the base of the oak tree, on his land but visible from his mother's grave in the adjacent cemetery. He commissioned a headstone from a mason in the next town over, specifying the exact wording he wanted: Michael Jonathan Chen, also known as Thomas Morrow. 1943-1993, beloved father, husband, and brother. He gave everything to keep us safe. He also began making plans for the Treehouse, inspired by something Sarah had said and by the overwhelming response to Jessica's article. People were interested in this story, were moved by it. Maybe there was a way to share this space while still honoring its sacred nature. Clay started designing a small museum of sorts, not in the treehouse itself, which would remain a private sanctuary, but in a structure he'd build nearby. He'd display copies of the journal entries, photographs of his father's 2 lives, documentation of the drug smuggling case and its aftermath. He'd tell the story not just of Michael Chen and Thomas Morrow, but of the price of doing the right thing, the nature of sacrifice, and the enduring power of love. But that was future work. First, there was the burial to attend to. The ceremony took place on a Saturday morning in late summer. Clay had expected a handful of people, Sarah, maybe a few townspeople, the Chen family members Victor had mentioned. Instead, he arrived at the oak tree to find over 50 people gathered. There were Chens who'd driven from San Francisco, Victor and his wife, aunts and uncles, cousins of various ages. There were people from Redemption Flats he barely knew, townspeople who'd read the article and felt moved to attend. There was Sheriff Kowalski in his dress uniform, representing law enforcement in respect for a man who'd sacrificed everything to help bring criminals to justice. Margaret Foster from the cemetery had volunteered to say a few words, and she stood now near the burial spot Clay had prepared. Clay held the urn with his father's ashes, feeling the weight of it, feeling the weight of all these years finally coming to resolution. "We gather today to honor Michael Jonathan Chen and Thomas Morrow," Margaret began. "These two names belong to one man who faced an impossible choice and chose love over safety, chose sacrifice over comfort. He testified against criminals knowing the cost would be his identity, his family, his entire life. And when danger came looking for him, he disappeared, not out of cowardice, but out of protection for those he loved most." She looked at Clay, his son. Clayton spent 40 years believing he'd been abandoned. But the truth, as we now know, was far different. Michael Chen loved his son every day of his life. He carried photographs of his family until his last breath. He sent money when he could. He watched from a distance, making sure they were safe. And he left this cache of truth hidden in a tree, hoping that someday it would be found and understood. Clay stepped forward and knelt at the base of the oak tree. He dug the space himself, proper depth and care, right among the massive roots. He placed the urn gently in the earth and then did something he'd planned carefully. He added other items to the burial: his father's wallet, the photographs from California, one of the books his father had kept. These things would rest here with him, return to the land he'd loved. Victor Chen came forward next, carrying a small box. "On behalf of the Chen family, I want to add something. This was our grandfather's pocket watch, given to him when he came to America. Uncle Michael should have inherited it, but he disappeared before that could happen. We'd like him to have it now." He placed the watch in the grave next to the urn. Clay felt tears streaming down his face, but made no effort to wipe them away. This was right. This was family coming together across time and loss, and finally making peace. One by one, people came forward to add something to the burial or say a few words. Sarah brought wildflowers from her garden and laid them gently on the earth. Martha Henley brought a photograph of the diner as it had looked in the 70s, when Diane had worked there and Thomas had been a regular customer. Bob Sutton brought a handwritten note expressing regret for judging without knowing the full story. The Chen family members each said something: memories of Michael as a young man, stories Clay had never heard, pieces of his father's life before Redemption Flats. He learned that Michael had been a talented artist, that he'd wanted to be a teacher before he'd gone into business, that he'd had a dry sense of humor and a soft spot for stray animals. When everyone had finished, Clay stood and spoke for the first time. "My father left me a list of things he wanted me to know. One of them was, family isn't just blood, it's the people who show up when you need them. Looking around at all of you today, I see the truth in that. Some of you share my father's blood. Others are here because you understand that this story matters, that this kind of sacrifice and love deserves to be honored. You all showed up, and that makes you family." He picked up a handful of earth and let it fall gently over the urn. "Dad, you can rest now. You're home. You're with Mom or close enough. And I understand now. I forgive you. And more than that, I'm proud of you. You did the hard thing because it was the right thing. You lived those lessons you wanted to teach me. And I promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying to live them too." Others came forward to add earth to the grave, and slowly the burial was completed. The Chen family members stayed after most others had left, and Clay found himself surrounded by relatives he'd never known existed. Aunts and uncles sharing memories, cousins asking questions, everyone trying to bridge the gap of lost years. Victor pulled Clay aside as the day was ending. "There's something you should know. After Uncle Michael disappeared, my father hired private investigators to try to find him. They never did, but they turned up some interesting information. Victor Reyes, the man Uncle Michael named in his journal as the one who'd come looking for him in Redemption Flats. He didn't die until 1993, which means my father was running from him for 17 years, Clay finished, right up until the end. And when Reyes was finally killed in that compound raid, it must have seemed like it was over. Maybe that's why Uncle Michael's payment stopped, not because he died right away, but because he finally felt safe enough to try to come home. So Clay absorbed this, but he died before he could. Exactly. According to the dates, Reyes was killed in August 1993. Uncle Michael died in November, just 3 months. 3 months after spending 17 years running, he finally would have been free to come back. But he died in that accident before he could. Victor's eyes were wet. He was so close to making it home. The tragedy of this timing was almost unbearable. 3 more months and Michael Chen might have returned to Redemption Flats, might have revealed himself to Clay, might have had years left to know his son and be known by him. Instead, fate or chance or simple bad luck had taken him right at the threshold of freedom. He loved you very much, Victor said. Everything in his journal, everything he did, it all came from love. I hope you can take some comfort in that. I do, I really do. And Clay meant it. The pain of his father's absence hadn't disappeared, but it had been transformed. He carried it differently now, not as a wound, but as a scar, evidence of something that had hurt, but had also healed, proof of survival. As evening fell and the last visitors departed, Clay stood alone at his father's grave. The headstone would be installed next week, but for now there was just fresh earth and the oak tree standing sentinel above it. Clay thought about his father, spending his last years in California, tending his small garden, reading his books, carrying photographs of the family he'd left behind. He'd been alone, but perhaps not lonely, holding on to love and memory even in exile. You tried to come home, Clay said softly to the earth. You were going to come back. I wish you'd made it, but I understand why you didn't, and I'm going to make sure people remember you, not as the man who left, but as the man who loved enough to sacrifice everything. The oak tree rustled in the evening breeze, and Clay felt a sense of rightness settle over him. His father was home. The truth was known, and now the real work could begin. The work of honoring that truth by building something lasting, something that would tell this story to future generations and remind them that love comes in many forms, sometimes even in the form of absence, of distance, of sacrifice so deep it looks like abandonment until you understand the whole story. Clay locked the treehouse door and walked back toward his truck as stars began to emerge overhead. Tomorrow he'd start planning the memorial museum. Tomorrow he'd begin figuring out how to share this space and this story with the world. But tonight, he'd rest in the knowledge that he'd finally brought his father home, and that in doing so, he'd found himself, the man he was meant to be, the son of Michael Chen and Thomas Morrow, inheritor of both names and both legacies. 3 months after the burial, the Memorial Museum was taking shape. Clay had worked with a local contractor to build a small structure near the oak tree, just 1 room, carefully designed to be unobtrusive in the landscape. The walls were lined with display cases that were starting to be filled with the artifacts of his father's life. In one case, copies of journal pages were mounted under glass, showing his father's handwriting and his struggle with the decision to leave. In another, photographs told the story chronologically. Michael Chen as a young man, his wedding too, his first wife, his time in Vietnam, then Thomas Morrow with Diane and baby Clay, and finally the solitary years in California. Clay had commissioned a local artist to create a timeline on one wall, marking major events in his father's life and in the larger context of witness protection law, drug trafficking in the 1970s, and the price paid by those who chose to testify. It was educational as much as memorial, designed to help visitors understand not just one man's story, but the broader social issues involved. The centerpiece of the museum was a video Clay had recorded, sitting in the treehouse, telling the full story in his own words. Jessica Chen had helped him with the technical aspects, making sure the audio and lighting were good. In the video, Clay talked about growing up without his father, about the anger and confusion, about returning to Redemption Flats and building the treehouse, and finally about the discovery that had changed everything. "I thought I was building a structure," Clay said in the video, "but what I was really building was a bridge to my father, to the past, to understanding. And what I learned is that sometimes love looks like abandonment until you know the whole story. Sometimes the people who seem to have left us were actually standing guard at a distance, keeping us safe from dangers we never knew existed." The museum was scheduled to open to the public in January, but Clay gave Victor Chen and his family a private preview in early December. They drove up from San Francisco. Victor and his wife, two of Michael's surviving siblings, both in their 70s now, and several cousins. Clay watched their faces as they moved through the displays, seeing them encounter aspects of Michael's life they'd never known. One of Michael's brothers, Dennis Chen, stopped in front of a photograph of Michael in his Marine uniform. "I forgot how young he looked back then. We all thought he'd make the military his career. He was good at it, disciplined and brave. But when he came back from Vietnam, something had changed in him. He was quieter, more serious. I think he'd seen things that made him question a lot about the world. That probably made it easier for him to spot the drug smuggling," Clay said. "He knew what heroin was doing to soldiers overseas. When he saw it being brought into the country through his company, he couldn't ignore it." "No, he couldn't." Dennis shook his head sadly. "Michael always had this, I don't know what to call it, this need to make things right. Even as kids, if someone was being bullied or cheated, Michael would step in. He couldn't stand injustice." Michael's sister, Grace Chen Wong, was crying quietly as she looked at the photographs of Michael with Diane and Clay. "He looked happy in these, really happy. I'm glad he had that, even if it was brief." "My mother loved him," Clay said. "I'm certain of that. I wish she'd known the truth before she died, but I think she loved him regardless." Victor was studying the display about the lumber mill accident, reading the brief article Clay had enlarged and mounted. "3 months," he said softly. "If he'd waited just 3 more months to start that job, if he'd been anywhere else that day, he might have lived. He might be here right now, meeting all of us, finally safe after all those years." The cruelty of that timing struck them all. Clay had thought about it often. His father finally free from the threat he'd been running from, finally able to imagine a return to Redemption Flats, only to die in a random workplace accident. There was no meaning in it, no lesson, just the randomness of fate, the way life can end before the story feels finished. "I've been thinking about something," Grace said. "Michael gave up his name, his identity, his family. He became a ghost to protect you, Clay. But he never stopped being himself. Do you understand what I mean? He still sent money when he could. He still kept your photographs. He still wrote in journals about his struggle and his love. His circumstances changed, but his character didn't. That's what I want my children and grandchildren to understand. That integrity isn't about whether life is easy or hard. It's about staying true to your values no matter what you lose." Clay nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I want this museum to say. That's why I built it. After the Chens left, promising to return for the official opening in January, Clay spent time alone in the museum. He'd done good work here. The displays were clear and compelling, the story well told. But something was still missing, and he couldn't quite identify what it was. Sarah found him there as dusk was falling. She'd been helping with the museum project from the beginning, offering suggestions and encouragement, bringing meals when Clay worked late into the evening. "It's beautiful, Clay. You should be proud." "I am, but there's something more that needs to happen, and I can't figure out what it is." Sarah looked around the room thoughtfully. "You've told your father's story wonderfully, but maybe what's missing is the next chapter, your story. What you're doing now because of what you learned." Clay considered this. She was right. The museum ended with the discovery and the burial, but it didn't address what came after. And wasn't that just as important? His father's sacrifice had shaped Clay's life for 68 years, but what was Clay going to do with however many years remained? "I don't know what my story is yet," Clay admitted. "I'm still figuring it out." Then maybe that's what the museum needs, a space that's unfinished, that invites people to think about their own stories. Because that's the real power of what you've created here. It's not just about one man's sacrifice. It's about how we understand the people who shaped us, how we make meaning from pain, how we honor the past while building the future. Over the next month, Clay added a new element to the museum. He created an interactive section where visitors could write responses to questions. How has your understanding of someone changed when you learned their full story? What sacrifices have been made for you that you didn't recognize at the time? How do you want to honor the people who shaped your life? He installed a book where people could write longer reflections, and he made a wall where photographs and brief stories about other families could be posted. The museum became not just about the Morrow family, but about the universal themes of sacrifice, love, misunderstanding, and reconciliation. The response was beyond anything Clay had imagined. The official opening in January drew over 200 people, locals from Redemption Flats, members of the Chen family, people from neighboring towns who'd heard about the story. Jessica's article had been picked up by larger publications, and there were even a few journalists from regional newspapers attending the opening. But it was the individual visitors in the weeks and months after that affected Clay most deeply. He made a point of being at the museum several days a week, available to talk with people who had questions or wanted to share their own stories. A woman named Patricia drove 4 hours to visit after reading about the museum online. She told Clay that her father had been in witness protection in the 1980s and that the family had been relocated 3 times before she was 18. "I spent my whole adolescence angry at my father for uprooting us, for making us live under false names, for ruining my life. But reading your father's story helped me understand what he was protecting us from. I called him yesterday. We hadn't spoken in 5 years, and I apologized. We talked for 3 hours. A man named Robert brought his teenage son to the museum and made the boy read every display. Afterward, Robert told Clay, his mother left us when he was young, and he's angry about it. I wanted him to see that sometimes there are reasons people leave that have nothing to do with not loving their children. I don't know if it'll help, but at least now he's thinking about it differently." An elderly woman named Helen sat on the bench Clay had placed in the museum and cried quietly as she read the journal entries. When Clay asked if she was all right, she said, "My husband died 20 years ago. I always thought our marriage had been happy, but after he died, I found out he'd been having an affair for the last 10 years of his life. I've been carrying that betrayal ever since. But reading about your father, about how he kept secrets to protect, not to hurt, it makes me wonder if there's more to my husband's story than I knew. Maybe he was protecting me from something too. Maybe I need to investigate before I finish being angry." These conversations multiplied day after day. The museum became a place of pilgrimage for people working through their own family mysteries and complications. Clay found himself in the role of counselor, listener, and witness to other people's pain and healing. It was exhausting and meaningful in equal measure. By spring, Clay knew he'd created something that extended far beyond his original intention. The treehouse had been personal, a way to connect with his father's memory. But the museum had become communal, a space where people could bring their own stories and find resonance, understanding, and perhaps healing. Sarah had been right. The story wasn't finished because Clay's life wasn't finished. And the most important part of the story was what came after discovery, after understanding. It was what you did with the truth once you had it, how you honored it, how you shared it, how you used it to make meaning and connection in a world that often felt fragmented and lonely. Late one evening in April, as Clay was closing up the museum, he noticed a young man standing outside, hesitant to come in. Clay recognized the body language. This was someone who wanted to enter, but wasn't sure if his story was significant enough, if his pain mattered enough to deserve space here. "We're technically closed," Clay called out, "but if you'd like to come in, you're welcome." "I've got time." The young man approached slowly. He was maybe 30, with shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "I saw the article about this place, about your dad, and He stopped, struggling to find words. "Come in," Clay said gently, unlocking the door. "Whatever it is, you're welcome here." They sat on the bench together, and the young man told his story. An alcoholic father who'd been abusive, years of therapy trying to understand and forgive, a recent discovery that his father had been suffering from PTSD from military service and had been self-medicating with alcohol because the VA system had failed him. "I don't know how to hold both things in my head," the young man said. "He hurt me. He scared me as a kid, but he was also hurting and no one helped him. I want to forgive him, but I also want him to take responsibility for what he did. Can both things be true?" Clay thought about his father, how Michael Chen had been both a good man and an absent one, how his choices had been both necessary and devastating. "Yes," Clay said firmly. "Both things can be true. People are complicated. Your father can be someone who hurt you and someone who was hurting. You can acknowledge his pain and still honor your own. That's not a contradiction, that's just being human." They talked for over an hour, and when the young man left, he seemed lighter somehow, as if sharing his burden and having it acknowledged had relieved some of its weight. Clay locked the museum door and walked over to his father's grave, where the headstone now stood proud against the oak tree. "I think I finally understand what you wanted me to do," Clay said to the stone. "Build something that lasts. You didn't just mean a physical structure. You meant build connections, build understanding, build a legacy of truth-telling and compassion. This museum, it's not really about you anymore. It's about everyone who needs to understand their story better, who needs to forgive or be forgiven, who needs to know they're not alone in their complicated feelings about the people who shaped them." The oak tree rustled in the evening breeze, and Clay felt at peace. He was doing exactly what his father had asked him to do. He was making something meaningful out of pain. He was honoring love, even when it came disguised as loss. And he was building something that would outlast both of them, not just walls and displays, but a living legacy of healing and understanding. The first anniversary of discovering the contents of the oak tree arrived in late September. Clay had planned a small ceremony, just a few people, some words spoken at his father's grave, maybe a meal afterward with Sarah and whatever Chen family members could make the drive. But as the day approached, he realized it had grown into something much larger. The museum had been featured in a documentary about witness protection and its impact on families. That exposure had brought even more visitors, and many had written to ask if they could attend the anniversary gathering. Clay found himself coordinating what was essentially a conference with multiple speakers and workshops about family secrets, forgiveness, and healing. The event took place over a full weekend. Clay had arranged for tents to be set up on his property, for folding chairs to be rented, for a sound system that would allow speakers to be heard by the 100 or so people expected to attend. The Redemption Flats Chamber of Commerce had gotten involved, seeing this as an opportunity to bring attention to their small town. Sheriff Kowalski opened the event with remarks about the importance of truth and justice. He talked about how Michael Chen's testimony had helped take down a major drug operation, and how that single act of courage had rippled outward, saving lives Clay would never know about. Victor Chen spoke about finding family after years of loss, and about how the Chen side of Clay's heritage had embraced him completely. "We gained a cousin, a nephew, a connection to a brother we thought we'd lost forever. Clay has given us back a piece of our history, and we've given him roots he didn't know he had. That's the power of truth. It connects what was broken." A psychologist named Dr. Sarah Martinez gave a presentation on family systems and secrets, using the Morrow-Chen story as a case study in how hidden information can shape multiple generations. Clay spent 42 years believing he'd been abandoned, and that belief influenced every relationship, every decision, every moment of his life. When the truth emerged, it didn't erase those 42 years, but it recontextualized them. Healing isn't about changing the past, it's about changing our understanding of the past. Patricia, the woman whose father had been in witness protection, spoke about her own journey toward forgiveness and understanding. Several other visitors who'd found meaning in the museum shared their stories as well. The event became a collective testimony to the ways families break and heal, to the complicated nature of love, and to the possibility of reconciliation even after death. On Sunday afternoon, as the event was winding down, Clay stood to speak for the last time. He'd been asked to offer closing remarks, to tie together everything that had been shared over the weekend. He stood near his father's grave, the oak tree rising behind him, the museum visible in the near distance. "A year ago, I thought I was just building a treehouse," Clay began. "I thought I was doing something simple, creating a structure to honor my father's memory. But what I actually did was open a door. Not just the physical door into the hollow of that oak tree, but a door into understanding, into truth, into connection. And once that door was open, I couldn't close it. I didn't want to close it. Because what I found on the other side was far more valuable than I ever imagined. I found out my father loved me. That's the simple version. But the complex version is that I learned love takes many forms. Sometimes it looks like presence, like showing up every day and being there. But sometimes it looks like absence, like staying away to keep someone safe. Both are valid. Both are real. Both require sacrifice. I also learned that the stories we tell ourselves about our lives matter tremendously. For 4 decades, I told myself a story about being unwanted, about not being enough to make my father stay. That story shaped everything. It made me afraid of attachment, made me believe everyone eventually left, made me angry at the world. But it was a false story, built on incomplete information. When I discovered the truth, that my father left precisely because I was precious to him, because I was worth protecting, that story changed. And when the story changed, I changed. I'm still the same person in some ways. I still have all the same memories, all the same experiences. But I understand them differently now, and that understanding has set me free. This museum exists because I believe other people need that same freedom. We all carry stories about our families, our childhoods, the people who shaped us. Some of those stories are accurate, and some are based on misunderstandings or incomplete information. Some of the people who hurt us were themselves hurting. Some of the people who left us were actually standing guard at a distance. Some of the people we resented were doing the best they could with impossible circumstances. I'm not saying everyone who abandons a child has a noble reason. I'm not saying all absent parents are actually protecting their children. Some people really do just leave, really don't care enough to stay, really do prioritize themselves over their responsibilities. But some, like my father, made impossible choices and lived with the consequences because love demanded it. The work of adulthood is figuring out which story is true in your particular case, and then deciding what to do with that truth. Do you forgive? Do you set boundaries? Do you reconcile? Do you mourn and move on? There's no single right answer. But whatever you decide should be based on truth, not on assumptions or incomplete information. So I invite all of you to keep seeking truth in your own families, your own stories. Ask questions, research, look beyond the surface narrative. And then, once you have the truth, do the hard work of deciding what it means and how you want to respond. My father left me a list of things he wanted me to know. The last item on that list was, "I loved you from the moment I held you, and I'll love you until my last breath and beyond." That was true. And because it was true, everything else became possible. The forgiveness, the understanding, the healing, this museum, this gathering today. Love makes all things possible, even when it comes disguised as loss. That's what I learned from a year inside an oak tree, discovering my father's secrets and learning to see my life through new eyes. The crowd was silent for a long moment after Clay finished speaking. Then Victor Chen began to applaud, and others joined in, until the applause became a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Clay felt embarrassed by the attention, but also deeply moved. He'd never imagined when he started building a treehouse that it would lead to this, to a community of people connected by their shared experience of family complexity, all seeking understanding and healing. As people began to leave, many stopped to hug Clay or shake his hand to thank him for creating this space and sharing his story. Sarah stood near the oak tree, watching with a satisfied smile. When the last visitor had gone and the rental company was taking down the tents, she walked over to where Clay was standing by his father's grave. "Your father would be proud," she said simply. "I hope so. I really hope so. Clay, what you've built here, it's remarkable. This museum, this community, this legacy. You took the worst pain of your life and transformed it into something that helps others. That's not nothing. That's everything." Clay looked at the treehouse, the museum, the grave, the oak tree that had made all of this possible. "I couldn't have done it without you. You've been here every step of the way. That's what family does," Sarah said, using his father's definition. "They show up." That evening, after everyone had left and the property was quiet again, Clay climbed into the treehouse one more time. He'd been so busy with the museum and the anniversary event that he hadn't spent much time in here lately. But this was still the heart of everything, still the most sacred space. He sat on the bench he'd built and ran his hand over the wood where his father had carved his initials decades ago. The wood was smooth, worn by time and touch. Clay had added his own initials nearby, creating a link between generations. Maybe someday, if he had children or if the Chen cousins had children who took an interest, there would be more initials carved here, more connections made. The list his father had written was framed now, hanging on the wall of the museum. But Clay had memorized it long ago. He went through it in his mind, checking off the items he'd accomplished. Be good to people who loved you. He was trying, especially with Sarah and the Chen family. Respect old things. He'd built this entire project around respecting the oak tree and his father's memory. Making a mistake doesn't define you. Clay had made plenty of mistakes in his life, but he was trying to make things right now. Love is worth the risk. He was learning this slowly, letting people in, building connections. Sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same. Clay understood this in his bones now. You're stronger than you know. He'd proven this by surviving his father's absence, and then by having the courage to seek the truth. Family isn't just blood. Sarah, Victor, the museum visitors, they were all family now. Build something that lasts. The treehouse, the museum, the community he'd created. The 9th item was his father's apology, which Clay had accepted fully. And the 10th was the declaration of love, which Clay now believed with his whole heart. He'd done it. He'd lived the lessons his father had wanted to teach him. Not perfectly, he was still learning, still growing, but genuinely. And in doing so, he'd created something his father never could have imagined, something that extended far beyond their personal story to touch hundreds of lives. Clay locked the treehouse and walked back to his house under a sky brilliant with stars. 69 years old now, and he felt like his life was just beginning. He had purpose, he had family, he had a legacy to tend and grow. The years of aimless drifting were over. He was rooted now, connected to this land and these people and this story that was both uniquely his and universally resonant. His father had given him a gift in the most unlikely way, not through presence, but through absence that turned out to be protection. Not through spoken words, but through written ones discovered decades late. Not through a conventional inheritance, but through a mystery that unfolded like a flower finally blooming after a long winter. Clay Morrow had spent most of his life feeling lost. But he wasn't lost anymore. He was found. And in being found, he'd become a finder for others, helping them locate the truth in their own family stories, helping them bridge the gap between pain and understanding, helping them transform loss into meaning. That was the real treasure hidden in the oak tree. Not the journals or photographs or documents, valuable as those were. The real treasure was the possibility of transformation, the power of truth to heal, and the enduring strength of love, even when it came wrapped in the painful gift of distance and sacrifice. And that treasure would keep giving year after year, as long as the oak tree stood, and as long as people kept coming to this place, seeking answers to their own complicated family stories. Clay would be here, tending this legacy, honoring his father's memory not through grief, but through service, not through looking backward, but through helping others move forward. The work would continue, the healing would continue, the story would continue, and Clay was ready. Winter came to Redemption Flats with unusual force that year. Snow fell heavily in December, transforming the landscape into something pristine and quiet. The museum closed for the season, as Clay had planned. The structure wasn't heated well enough for winter visitors, and the roads to his property became treacherous when snow accumulated. But Clay didn't mind the closure. It gave him time to reflect, to plan for the coming year, and to work on a project he'd been considering for months. He wanted to write a book, not just about his father's story, but about all the stories he'd collected over the past year. With permission from the people who'd shared their experiences at the museum, he would compile a collection of testimonies about family secrets, forgiveness, and the complicated nature of love. He worked on it through the long winter evenings, Sarah often joining him with her own memories and insights. She'd become more than a neighbor and friend. She was his partner in this project, his closest confidant, his family in the truest sense. They'd grown old together in a way through this year of discovery and creation. "You should include your own transformation in the book," Sarah said one evening, as they sat by Clay's fireplace, manuscripts spread between them. "Not just the facts of what your father did, but how it changed you to learn the truth. I don't know if I can articulate that clearly. It's still happening, still unfolding. Then write about that. Write about being in the middle of change, not knowing where it leads. People need to hear that healing isn't a destination, it's a process that continues." Clay took her advice. He wrote about the anger he'd carried for decades, about the moment in the treehouse when everything he'd believed was overturned, about the grief of learning his father had died alone, just when freedom was finally possible. He wrote about forgiveness as something active, not passive, a choice made and remade each day. The book took him 4 months to complete. He titled it The Oak Tree's Secret, a son's discovery of his father's hidden love and the power of truth to heal. He found a small regional publisher who specialized in memoir and narrative nonfiction, and they agreed to publish it in time for the 2nd anniversary of his discovery. But before the book could come out, something unexpected happened. In early March, Clay received a letter forwarded from the museum. It was from a woman named Elizabeth Morrison, and her return address was Portland, Oregon. "Dear Mr. Morrow," the letter began, "I read about your father, Thomas Morrison, who died in a mill accident in 1993. I need to tell you something that might be difficult to hear. Thomas Morrison was my husband. We were married in 1988. I didn't know he had a son, or that Thomas wasn't his real name, until I read the article about your discovery. I'm reaching out because I think there are things you should know about his final years, and because I have something that belongs to you." Clay's hands shook as he read. His father had remarried, had found love again after Diane. The revelation was stunning and complicated. He wasn't sure if he felt happy his father hadn't been entirely alone, or hurt that Michael had built yet another secret life. He called the number Elizabeth had included in her letter. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice nervous. "Mr. Morrow, Clay?" "Yes, I got your letter. This is unexpected. I'm sure it is. I debated for weeks whether to contact you. But I kept thinking about what your article said, about truth being important even when it's complicated. And the truth is, your father and I were married for 5 years before he died. They talked for 2 hours. Elizabeth explained that she'd met Michael, who was using the name Thomas Morrison by then, at a community center where she volunteered. He'd been quiet and kind, helping set up chairs for events, always willing to lend a hand. They'd started having coffee after their volunteer shifts, and a friendship had developed into something more. He told me he'd been married before, that his wife had died of cancer, Elizabeth said. I had no idea that was only partly true, that she really had died, but that he'd left her long before. He said he'd been living alone for years, moving around, and that he was tired of running. I didn't know what he meant by running until I read your article. Did he seem happy with you? I think so. We had a good life together. Simple but good. We both worked, came home to each other, spent weekends hiking or reading. He had nightmares sometimes, and he'd wake up disoriented, calling out for Diane or for Clay. I asked who they were, and he'd say they were people from his past, people he'd lost. I thought he meant they died. Clay's vision blurred. His father had called out for him in his sleep, even years after leaving. The ache of that loss had never left him. I have boxes of his things, Elizabeth continued. Personal items I kept after he died. I've remarried since. It's been over 30 years, but I never got rid of Tom's belongings. I kept thinking someday someone might want them. Now I know that someone is you. Would you like me to send them, or would you prefer to come to Portland? Clay decided to go to Portland. He needed to meet this woman who'd been his father's wife, needed to see the place where Michael Chen had spent his final years. Sarah offered to come with him, and Clay accepted gratefully. They made the drive in late March, as winter was finally releasing its grip on the mountain passes. Portland was rainy and green, utterly different from the high desert of Redemption Flats. Elizabeth Morrison Reeves lived in a comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood, and she welcomed them with obvious nervousness. She was in her late 60s now, a small woman with gray hair and kind eyes. Her current husband, David, greeted them politely and then excused himself to give them privacy. Elizabeth led Clay and Sarah to her dining room, where several boxes were already stacked on the table. I pulled out everything I kept of Tom's, she said. I want you to take whatever you'd like. The rest I'll donate or dispose of. It's time. Clay opened the first box with hands that trembled slightly. Inside were more books, more clothes, more of the ordinary objects that make up a life. But there were also photographs of Elizabeth and Thomas together, smiling at the camera, clearly happy. Clay stared at these images of his father, looking relaxed and content in a way Clay had never seen in the older photos from Redemption Flats. He looks different here, Clay said. He'd stopped running, Elizabeth replied. Victor Reyes had been killed. I know that now from your article. Tom must have felt safe for the first time in years. He could finally breathe, finally relax, finally think about being happy instead of just surviving. In another box, Clay found more journals. His father had continued writing, apparently, documenting his life with Elizabeth and his internal struggles with guilt over the family he'd left behind. Clay opened one to a random page and read, Elizabeth is good to me, better than I deserve. She doesn't know what I've done, how I left a wife and child to protect them. She thinks I'm uncomplicated, just a quiet man who likes routine and peace. If she knew the truth, would she still love me? I want to tell her, but the habit of secrecy is so deeply ingrained. Maybe some truths are meant to stay buried. Clay looked up at Elizabeth. Did he ever tell you the truth about his past? She shook her head. Not while he was alive. The man I knew was Thomas Morrison, mill worker, volunteer, husband. I didn't know about Michael Chen or the drug smuggling or witness protection until I read that article about you. Part of me wishes he'd trusted me enough to tell me, but another part understands why he didn't. He'd spent so long being someone else that maybe he'd forgotten how to be honest. In the bottom of the last box was a manila envelope with "For Clayton Morrow, Redemption Flats, Wyoming," written on it in his father's handwriting. Elizabeth's hands shook as she handed it to Clay. I found this after Tom died, in his desk drawer. I didn't know who Clayton Morrow was, or where Redemption Flats was exactly. This was before internet search was what it is now. I tried calling information, but there were too many Morrows, and I didn't have enough information to narrow it down. Eventually I put it away, thinking maybe someday I'd figure it out. But I never did. Now it can finally reach you. Clay opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter and a small photograph. The photo showed Clay at maybe 16 or 17, walking down the main street of Redemption Flats with his mother. They were carrying shopping bags, caught in a candid moment. Clay didn't remember this being taken, which meant his father had been there, watching from a distance, stealing these glimpses of the life he'd left behind. The letter was dated October 1993, just a month before his father died. Dear Clayton, if you're reading this, then Elizabeth has managed to find you, or you found her. I hope she's told you that I remarried, that I tried to build a life after leaving Redemption Flats. I need you to know that loving Elizabeth didn't mean I stopped loving your mother or you. The heart has infinite capacity. Loss doesn't subtract from love, it adds to it. I'm writing this because Victor Reyes is dead. I saw it in the newspaper 2 months ago, and for the first time in 17 years, I feel like I can breathe. The men who were hunting me are gone, dead or imprisoned. I could come home. I could tell you everything, could apologize in person, could try to build some kind of relationship with you, even after all this time. I'm thinking about it seriously. Elizabeth knows something is on my mind, but I haven't told her yet. I'm trying to figure out how to explain why I need to return to a place I left decades ago, why I need to find a son I abandoned to protect. But I will tell her. I will go back. I will find you, Clayton, and I will finally explain everything. I want you to know your old man tried his best, even when his best wasn't enough. I want to meet the man you've become. I want to see if there's any possibility of forgiveness and reconciliation. I'm planning to come to Redemption Flats this spring, once winter passes and the road's clear. I'll find you then and we'll talk. We'll have time to rebuild what I tore down. I'm looking forward to it more than I can express. Until then, know that I never stopped being your father, never stopped loving you, never stopped hoping that someday we'd have another chance. Your father always, Michael. Clay closed his eyes, overwhelmed. His father had been planning to come back, had been preparing to reveal himself, to seek reconciliation. The accident had occurred just weeks after this letter was written, cutting off that possibility before it could become reality. He was going to come home, Clay said, his voice breaking. He was finally going to come back. Elizabeth was crying too. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. If I had understood, if he'd told me... She stopped, unable to continue. Sarah put her arm around Clay's shoulders. He tried. He was going to try. They sat in Elizabeth's dining room for a long time. 3 people connected by a man who was gone, but whose love still rippled outward, still shaped their lives decades after his death. Clay learned more about his father's final years, how he'd taken up woodworking as a hobby, how he'd been teaching Elizabeth's nephew to carve, how he'd been planning their first real vacation together, maybe a trip to Wyoming, though he hadn't explained why. Take these, Elizabeth finally said, gesturing to the boxes. Take all of it. These are pieces of your father, and you should have them. They've been waiting for you all this time. Clay and Sarah loaded the boxes into their truck. Before they left, Clay hugged Elizabeth, this woman who'd loved his father when he couldn't, who'd given Michael Chen a few years of peace and happiness before the end. She hugged him back fiercely. Thank you for finding me, Elizabeth said. Thank you for not being angry that I existed, that I didn't know about you. Thank you for understanding that love is complicated and that your father did his best. Thank you for loving him, Clay replied. Thank you for giving him those years of happiness. He deserved that. The drive back to Redemption Flats was long and emotional. Clay and Sarah stayed overnight in a motel halfway home, and they sat up late talking about what this new information meant. Your father was coming back, Sarah said. He'd decided to risk everything. Risk Elizabeth finding out he'd been lying about his past. Risk you rejecting him. Risk the fragile peace he'd built. Because he wanted to be your father again. But he died before he could. 3 weeks, maybe 4, between writing that letter and the accident. You're close. But the intention matters, Clay. He chose reconciliation. He chose truth. The accident prevented him from carrying it out, but his heart was already committed to it. Clay thought about this. His father's story was even more tragic than he'd realized. not just a man who'd sacrificed everything for his family's safety, but a man who'd finally earned the freedom to return, who'd made the decision to seek forgiveness, only to have fate intervene at the last possible moment. But there was also something beautiful in it. His father had died planning a reunion, looking forward to it, hoping for reconciliation. His last thoughts hadn't been of regret and permanent separation, but of anticipation and hope. That mattered. That made the story different somehow. When Clay returned to Redemption Flats, he added a new section to the museum. He included the letter from Elizabeth, photographs of his father's final years, and the October 1993 letter that showed Michael's intentions to return. He titled this section, "The Journey Home That Never Was," and used it to explore themes of intention, timing, and the way life sometimes ends before the story feels complete. The book, when it was published that summer, included a new chapter about Elizabeth and the discovery that his father had been planning to return. The publisher worried it might feel like an anticlimax, to learn that reconciliation was planned but never achieved. But Clay insisted it was essential to the truth of the story. "Life doesn't always give us neat endings," he wrote in the book's afterword. "My father and I never got our reunion. We never got to sit down and talk through everything that happened. I never got to tell him I understood and forgave him. He never got to meet me as an adult, never got to see what I made of my life. But the fact that he was trying, that he decided to come back, that matters. Intention matters. Love expressed in action, even action that never gets completed, matters. The story doesn't have to be perfect to be meaningful. It just has to be true." The book found an audience far beyond what Clay expected. It was reviewed in major newspapers, picked up by book clubs, discussed on podcasts about family dynamics and healing. People wrote to Clay from all over the country, sharing their own stories of incomplete reconciliations, of things left unsaid, of love that existed but was never properly expressed. And through it all, the museum continued its work. More visitors came each year, drawn by the book or by word of mouth. The oak tree stood sentinel over his father's grave, over the treehouse that had revealed so much, over the museum that had grown from one family's tragedy into a place of healing for thousands. Clay turned 70 that year, celebrated quietly with Sarah and a gathering of the Chen family. He'd lived longer now without his father than with him. 59 years of absence compared to 9 years of presence. But the quality of those years had changed completely since the discovery in the tree. He was no longer defined by abandonment, but by love that had taken an unusual form. Late one night, unable to sleep, Clay walked out to the oak tree under a full moon. The tree house was silvered with light, the museum beside it dark and quiet. His father's grave was marked now with wildflowers that Sarah had planted, blooming even in the late fall. "I hope you knew," Clay said to the earth, to the oak, to the memory of Michael Chen. "I hope in those final weeks when you were planning to come back, you felt joy at the prospect. I hope you imagined our reunion and felt excited, not just scared. I hope you died with hope in your heart, not just regret." The wind moved through the oak's remaining leaves, and Clay chose to hear it as an answer, a reassurance. His father had been coming home. That was the truth that mattered most. Not that he'd succeeded, but that he'd tried. Not that the reunion happened, but that it was planned with hope and love. Clay had spent most of his life believing he was unwanted. Then he'd learned he was precious. So precious his father had sacrificed everything to keep him safe. And now he understood an even deeper truth. He was wanted so badly that his father had been willing to risk everything he'd built to try to come back to him. That was the full story. That was the complete truth. And it was enough.